high above the Pacific Ocean, on a remote hill where California fades into sky and fog, stands a structure that was never meant to be finished. Not because it failed, but because it was never designed to stop. Hearst Castle is often described as a mansion, a palace, a monument to excess. But those words miss the truth. This was not just a building. It was a private empire constructed in silence, beyond public budgets, beyond oversight, and beyond any clear idea of cost. Every stone here was paid for. But not every price was recorded. Behind these walls are decades of invisible labor, continents dismantled and shipped across oceans, technologies installed before their time, and fortunes drained slowly, not in moments of collapse, but through persistence. This hill did not consume money once. It consumed it continuously. And today, what remains is not simply a castle but a question carved into stone. How much does it truly cost to build something when no one ever tells you to stop? Tonight, we step inside San Simeon not to admire what was built, but to uncover what was quietly lost. At dawn along the central coast of California, when fog rolls inland from the Pacific and clings to the rugged hills above San Simeon, a vast stone silhouette slowly emerges from the mist. Perched high above the ocean, isolated from cities and roads, it appears less like a residence and more like a citadel, an outpost removed from time itself. This is Hearst Castle. And yet, what rises from the hilltop is not merely architecture. It is the physical manifestation of power translated into stone, labor, distance, and silence. From the beginning, this place was never meant to function like an ordinary home. It was conceived as something far more ambitious. A private empire built beyond public accounting, beyond civic oversight, and beyond any conventional understanding of cost. While guidebooks and official histories often cite impressive, but finite construction figures, those numbers tell only a fraction of the truth. The real cost of San Simeon was not simply measured in dollars, but in decades, in human effort, in global extraction, and in an unchecked flow of resources that never had to justify itself. The hill itself was inherited, part of a vast ranch once owned by George Hearst, a self-made mining magnate and United States senator. To most heirs, such land would have represented stability, legacy, and wealth already secured. But to William Randolph Hearst, it represented something unfinished. From childhood, he had imagined this hill as a vantage point, a place from which one could look down upon the world, not merely geographically, but symbolically. It was here, far from Washington and Wall Street, that he would attempt to create something immune to limits. By the early 20th century, Hearst had already built one of the most powerful media empires in American history. His newspapers shaped elections, influenced wars, and molded public opinion on a national scale. Yet even that empire depended on circulation numbers, advertisers, public trust, and political compromise. San Simeon did not. It answered to no market and no audience. It existed solely to serve the will and imagination of one man. When construction began in earnest in 1919, there was no finalized master plan. Instead, there was a continuous process, one that evolved year after year, purchase after purchase, inspiration after inspiration. Hearst did not commission a house. He initiated a permanent state of building. Walls were erected only to be torn down. Towers were redesigned mid-construction. Entire wings were reimagined because a new artifact had been acquired in Europe and required a setting worthy of its age. This absence of finality is critical to understanding the hidden cost of San Simeon. In traditional architecture, budgets impose discipline. Decisions carry consequences. At Hearst Castle, cost functioned differently. There was always more money, more land, more time. Every delay generated additional expense. Every revision multiplied labor. Every aesthetic whim became structural reality. To bring this vision into existence, Hearst relied on Julia Morgan, an architect of extraordinary discipline and endurance. Trained in Paris and grounded in engineering rigor, she became the silent engine behind San Simeon's impossible demands. Over nearly 3 decades, Morgan translated an ever-changing stream of instructions into buildable form. She managed logistics, materials, workforce housing, and structural safety on a remote hilltop that had no infrastructure to support such ambition. Nothing arrived easily. Cement, steel, timber, marble, and copper all had to be transported up steep, unfinished roads. Skilled artisans were brought in from across the country and, in some cases, from abroad. These men and women did not come for a single project phase. Many lived on site for years, even decades. Their wages, housing, meals, and tools formed a continuous expense rarely captured in headline construction figures. Meanwhile, Hearst's collecting habits transformed the project into something unprecedented. From monasteries in Spain, palaces in Italy, and estates across Europe, architectural fragments were dismantled, shipped across the Atlantic, transported by rail across the United States, and hauled up the hill to San Simeon. Ceilings, doors, fireplaces, columns, objects centuries old, were absorbed into the castle not as museum pieces, but as functional components of a living structure. Each artifact carried hidden costs: purchase negotiations, export permissions, crating, insurance, ocean freight, rail freight, storage, restoration, and custom integration. These were not decorative expenses. They reshaped rooms, altered structural plans, and forced continuous redesign. A ceiling purchased in Madrid might require an entirely new wing to be reinforced. A set of columns from Florence could dictate ceiling heights, load paths, and foundations. As years passed, San Simeon ceased to be a construction site in the conventional sense. It became a permanent organism, always growing, always adapting, always consuming resources. During the same decades, when the United States experienced economic booms and devastating collapse, work on the hill rarely stopped. Even during the Great Depression, when millions lost homes and livelihoods, construction at San Simeon continued, funded quietly through Hearst's private wealth and corporate holdings. This persistence revealed the true nature of the project. Hearst Castle was not built for efficiency, comfort, or even legacy in the traditional sense. It was built to externalize power, to make wealth visible, immovable, and eternal. The castle did not need to earn its existence. It existed because it could. And yet, for all its scale and splendor, San Simeon remained strangely private. It was never open to the public during Hearst's lifetime. Access was controlled. Photography was limited. Accounting was opaque. The castle functioned as a closed system, shielded from scrutiny by distance, celebrity, and sheer complexity. To understand the real cost of this place, one must look beyond receipts and estimates. The expense of San Simeon lies in what it required to sustain a workforce without an end date, a supply chain spanning continents, and a vision unrestrained by consequence. It is here, in these unseen layers, that the true price of Hearst's private empire begins to emerge. And as we move deeper into the story, the question becomes unavoidable. How much does it truly cost to build something that is never meant to be finished? To understand the true cost of San Simeon, one must look not at stone or ornament, but at the human machinery required to keep the hill alive. Architecture of this scale does not rise by inspiration alone. It demands labor, continuous, disciplined, and often invisible. And at Hearst Castle, labor was not a temporary phase. It became a permanent condition. From the earliest years of construction, San Simeon functioned less like a building site and more like an isolated industrial settlement. The hill had no existing infrastructure capable of supporting hundreds of workers. Roads were narrow, unfinished, and dangerous. Electricity had to be generated locally. Water systems had to be engineered from scratch. Before a single tower could rise, an entire logistical ecosystem had to be invented simply to allow people to live and work at the site. Carpenters, masons, steelworkers, electricians, plumbers, plasterers, painters, and stonecutters were recruited from across California and beyond. Many arrived expecting short-term contracts. Instead, they found themselves absorbed into a project that never reached completion. Months turned into years. Years turned into decades. Some workers spent the majority of their professional lives building a structure that was always described as still in progress. Unlike commercial construction, where deadlines impose limits on labor costs, San Simeon operated under a different logic. There was no fixed completion date. No financial incentive to accelerate. Work continued at a deliberate, almost ritual pace. Walls were refined repeatedly. Decorative elements were removed and replaced. Entire rooms were reconfigured to accommodate newly acquired European artifacts. Each revision required additional hours, additional wages, additional skilled attention. This endless cycle had a compounding effect. Skilled laborers could not be easily replaced. Their familiarity with the site, its idiosyncrasies, and its evolving design made them indispensable. As a result, Hearst effectively maintained a long-term, highly specialized workforce, one whose cost accumulated quietly year after year, largely outside public awareness. Housing this workforce added another layer of hidden expense. Temporary barracks evolved into semi-permanent accommodations. Kitchens, dining facilities, and supply depots had to be maintained. Food had to be transported regularly to a remote hilltop. Medical care, transportation, and basic services became necessary simply to sustain daily operations. None of these costs appeared on architectural drawings, yet without them, construction would have collapsed. Overseeing this complex system was Julia Morgan, whose role extended far beyond design. She coordinated schedules, resolved structural conflicts, and managed the realities of construction under extreme conditions. Hearst communicated constantly, often from afar, sending letters filled with revisions, sketches, and new instructions. Morgan translated these ideas into actionable plans, frequently under pressure to implement changes without halting progress elsewhere on the site. The result was a form of architectural improvisation on an unprecedented scale. Buildings were never allowed to settle into finality. Stonework was adjusted after installation. Reinforcements were added midstream. Decorative ceilings were lifted and reset to achieve better proportions. Each adjustment required labor to undo previous labor, an inefficiency that would have been intolerable in any conventional project, but which became routine at San Simeon. Weather added another silent cost. The coastal environment subjected workers and materials to salt air, fog, wind, and seasonal rain. Structures required additional protection, sealing, and maintenance even before completion. Freshly finished surfaces sometimes deteriorated before they could be declared final, forcing rework that further extended labor timelines. The Great Depression exposed the unusual nature of this system. As construction projects across the nation halted and unemployment soared, work at San Simeon largely continued. Hearst scaled back public spending elsewhere, but maintained operations on the Hill. For many workers, the castle became an unlikely refuge during economic collapse. Wages were modest, conditions demanding, but employment was steady, another cost, absorbed quietly into the ongoing life of the project. Yet this continuity came at a price. Because construction never ended, there was no moment of release, no final inspection, no transition from building to preservation. Labor costs did not conclude, they transformed. Maintenance blended into construction. Construction blended into restoration. The workforce remained essential long after the castle had achieved its iconic appearance. By the late 1930s, San Simeon had consumed not just materials and money, but time on a scale rarely associated with private architecture. Thousands of man-years had been invested in a single personal estate. Skills that might have built schools, bridges, or civic institutions were concentrated instead on a mountaintop retreat. This is where the cost of San Simeon becomes difficult to quantify. How does one calculate the value of decades of human effort directed toward an object that served no public function? How does one measure the economic gravity of a project that quietly absorbed labor through prosperity and crisis alike? The castle's grandeur makes these questions easy to overlook. Visitors see towers, pools, and terraces frozen in apparent perfection. What they do not see is the labor history embedded in every surface, the countless hours repeated, revised, and erased in service of a vision that refused to conclude. And yet, Labor alone does not explain the full scale of the hidden cost. To keep this workforce supplied, to feed its appetite for materials and technology, San Simeon required something even more complex, a global supply chain, operating long before such systems became common. That story begins far from California, across oceans and centuries, in the dismantling of Europe itself. Long before the word globalization entered common use, San Simeon was already dependent on a supply chain that stretched across oceans, borders, and centuries. The hill above the Pacific did not merely consume local materials, it absorbed the physical remnants of Europe itself. Churches, monasteries, palaces, and estates, some abandoned, some deliberately dismantled, became silent contributors to a private American vision thousands of miles away. William Randolph Hearst did not collect art in the conventional sense. He collected environments. During repeated trips to Europe in the early decades of the 20th century, he acquired entire architectural elements, rather than isolated objects. Ceilings were removed beam by beam. Doorways were numbered, catalogued, and disassembled. Stone columns were separated from structures that had stood since the Middle Ages. These were not replicas or stylistic imitations. They were originals, extracted intact from their historical contexts. Each acquisition initiated a cascade of costs, rarely acknowledged as part of construction. Negotiations alone could take months, involving local governments, church authorities, aristocratic families, and export regulators. Once agreements were reached, specialists were hired to dismantle the structures without destroying them, an operation requiring expertise, patience, and meticulous documentation. Every beam and stone had to be labeled so that it could later be reassembled thousands of miles away. Transportation magnified these expenses exponentially. Crates weighing tons were moved by horse, truck, and rail to European ports, then shipped across the Atlantic. From East Coast harbors, they traveled by rail across the entire United States before reaching California. Even then, the journey was not complete. The final ascent up steep, unfinished roads to the San Simeon hilltop required custom solutions, heavy equipment, and additional labor. Every mile added cost. Every transfer increased risk. Insurance alone represented a significant, ongoing expense. These artifacts were irreplaceable. Damage during transport could mean total loss, not just financially but architecturally. Hearst Castle was designed around these objects. A cracked beam or shattered column could force entire rooms to be redesigned. As a result, shipments were insured repeatedly at different stages, often at escalating valuations. Once the materials arrived, the costs did not stop. European architectural elements rarely fit seamlessly into modern American construction. Centuries-old dimensions conflicted with contemporary structural standards. Stone that had once rested on medieval foundations now had to be supported by reinforced concrete and steel. Julia Morgan and her engineers were forced to invent hybrid solutions, modern skeletons disguised behind ancient skins. This fusion of eras came at a price. Reinforcement work was extensive and continuous. Floors were thickened. Walls were strengthened. Seismic considerations, virtually non-existent in the original European structures, had to be addressed in earthquake-prone California. Each imported artifact demanded not only preservation but adaptation, multiplying labor and material costs long after the purchase price had been paid. Restoration added yet another layer. Many artifacts arrived damaged by time, moisture, or previous neglect. Skilled conservators were required to clean, stabilize, and sometimes reconstruct missing elements. These specialists worked slowly, carefully, often over months on a single ceiling or set of panels. Their work was invisible to the casual observer, yet essential to the integrity of the final space. As shipments accumulated, storage became a problem of its own. Not all items could be installed immediately. Some waited years, sometimes decades, before Hearst decided where they belonged. Warehouses were rented. Temporary shelters were built. Items were unpacked, repacked, and periodically inspected to prevent deterioration. These holding costs, spread across time, never appeared in any single construction ledger. The psychological cost of this process is harder to measure, but no less real. San Simeon ceased to be anchored in a single historical narrative. Instead, it became a collage of displaced pasts. A Spanish monastery ceiling hovered above an American living space. Italian stone framed Californian views of the Pacific. French tapestries absorbed coastal light never intended for them. The castle was not European, nor American. It was something new, assembled through acquisition rather than evolution. By the late 1920s, Hearst's collecting had reached such scale that even he began to lose track of what he owned. Inventories ran into the tens of thousands of items. Some pieces were never installed at all. Others were placed temporarily and later removed. The act of collecting had outpaced the act of building, creating a backlog of cultural material waiting for purpose. This imbalance exposed one of the deepest hidden costs of San Simeon: inefficiency by abundance. When resources are unlimited, decisions lose urgency. Objects lose finality. Labor continues not because it must, but because it can. In this environment, waste does not appear as excess, it disguises itself as refinement. As global conditions shifted, these costs became harder to ignore. Political instability in Europe, followed by economic collapse in the United States, strained Hearst's finances. Yet the momentum of San Simeon made it difficult to stop. Artifacts already purchased still required care. Shipments already en route still needed to be received. Buildings partially designed around specific pieces could not simply be abandoned. By importing Europe piece by piece, Hearst had committed himself to a form of architectural dependency. San Simeon could not exist without constant inflow of materials, labor, and money. The castle had become a gravitational center, pulling resources toward itself, regardless of external circumstance. And as the world moved toward war, this fragile, extravagant system would face pressures it was never designed to withstand. If San Simeon had been only a collection of rooms and towers, its cost, however extravagant, might still have been comprehensible within the logic of architecture. But what made the project truly unprecedented was not what could be seen, but what had to be hidden. Beneath the stone facades, behind the carved doors and imported ceilings, Hearst Castle functioned as a self-contained technological system, closer in complexity to a small city than a private residence. At the time construction began, most rural areas of California lacked basic infrastructure. Electricity was unreliable or non-existent. Indoor plumbing was far from universal. Telephone service was limited, and centralized heating systems were rare outside major urban hotels. San Simeon, perched on an isolated hilltop miles from any town, had none of these advantages. Everything that powered daily life had to be created from the ground up. Electrical power alone required enormous investment. Generators had to be installed, maintained, and upgraded as the castle expanded. Wiring ran invisibly through walls that were constantly being redesigned, torn open, and sealed again. Each architectural change forced corresponding adjustments to the electrical system. Lights were not simply fixtures. They were part of a carefully controlled atmosphere, meant to illuminate European artifacts without damaging them, while maintaining an illusion of timelessness. Water posed an even greater challenge. The hill had no natural supply sufficient for a complex that included dozens of bathrooms, kitchens, fountains, ornamental pools, and later, swimming pools of monumental scale. Reservoirs were constructed. Pipes were laid across difficult terrain. Pressure systems were engineered to deliver water upward, against gravity, to the highest towers. These systems required continuous monitoring and repair, long before municipal water departments existed to absorb such responsibilities. The famous pools, often described as indulgent luxuries, were in fact technological feats. Filtration systems, heating mechanisms, and chemical treatments had to be designed at a time when such technologies were still experimental. Maintaining water clarity and safety demanded constant attention. Staff trained not as servants, but as technicians, worked behind the scenes to ensure these spaces functioned, without revealing the labor that sustained them. Heating further complicated the infrastructure. San Simeon's coastal climate could be cold and damp, especially at night. Traditional fireplaces were insufficient for the scale of the buildings and incompatible with the preservation needs of tapestries, woodwork, and paintings. As a result, complex heating systems were installed, concealed within walls and floors. Their operation required fuel delivery, ventilation, and routine maintenance, yet another invisible cost layered beneath the visible architecture. Communication systems added still more complexity. Telephones connected Hearst to his media empire, even when he was physically isolated on the hill. Internal communication networks allowed staff to coordinate across vast distances within the estate. These systems evolved over time, requiring upgrades and rewiring as technology advanced. Each improvement necessitated new disruptions to finished spaces, reopening walls that had only recently been declared complete. Waste management presented its own challenges. Sewage systems had to be engineered to handle large volumes without contaminating the surrounding land. This required careful planning, excavation, and ongoing inspection. Failures were unacceptable, not only for comfort but for health and environmental reasons. Unlike urban systems, there was no external authority to assume responsibility. Every malfunction fell back onto the castle's private operations. What made these systems especially costly was their lack of finality. As San Simeon continued to expand, infrastructure had to expand with it. Pipes installed for one wing proved insufficient for another. Electrical loads increased as more rooms were added. Technological progress rendered earlier systems obsolete, forcing replacements long before their expected lifespans had ended. Efficiency was constantly sacrificed to flexibility. Maintenance, therefore, never stabilized. There was no point at which the castle transitioned fully from construction to operation. The two states overlapped continuously. Technicians worked alongside builders. Repairs were indistinguishable from upgrades. The infrastructure existed in a perpetual state of adaptation, responding not to necessity, but to possibility. This technological ambition was driven by Hearst's desire for control. San Simeon was meant to function independently, insulated from the unpredictability of the outside world. Power outages elsewhere were irrelevant. Municipal shortages did not apply. The hill was its own jurisdiction, governed by private decision rather than public policy, yet this independence carried its own cost. Without economies of scale, every system was bespoke. Replacement parts were custom-made. Expertise had to be retained on site. Knowledge accumulated within individuals rather than institutions, making continuity fragile. When experienced staff left or retired, their understanding of the castle's inner workings often went with them. By the time San Simeon reached its mature form in the 1930s, the infrastructure beneath its beauty rivaled that of luxury hotels and hospitals of the era. But unlike those institutions, it served no paying public. It generated no revenue. It justified itself solely through use by its owner and invited guests. This is where the hidden cost becomes philosophical as well as financial. Infrastructure is typically built to support communities, economies, or futures beyond a single lifetime. At San Simeon, it supported an idea: one man's vision of permanence and command. The systems worked flawlessly when functioning, and invisibly when successful. But they consumed resources continuously, silently, without acknowledgement. And as global events began to intrude, war abroad, financial pressure at home, the burden of sustaining a private city on a hill would grow heavier, revealing the limits of even extraordinary wealth. By the early 1930s, San Simeon was no longer merely a construction project or a private retreat. It had become a stage. What unfolded on the hilltop during these years was not architecture in the traditional sense, but performance carefully curated, deliberately exclusive, and enormously expensive to sustain. William Randolph Hearst transformed the estate into a social theater where power, culture, and celebrity intersected. Politicians, industrialists, actors, writers, and filmmakers were invited not simply as guests, but as witnesses. Their presence validated the castle's purpose. Each weekend gathering reinforced the illusion that San Simeon was not excess, but inevitability. These visits carried costs that rarely appear in historical tallies. Entire wings were staffed at full capacity regardless of actual occupancy. Kitchens operated on a scale comparable to luxury hotels, preparing elaborate meals that often required ingredients shipped long distances to meet Hearst's standards. Wine cellars were stocked continuously. Linen, tableware, and furnishings were replaced or refreshed to maintain perfection under scrutiny. Staffing expanded accordingly. Servants, cooks, chauffeurs, groundskeepers, and attendants worked in synchronized shifts to preserve an atmosphere of effortless grandeur. The labor required to make leisure appear natural was immense. Nothing about San Simeon's hospitality was spontaneous. Every detail was rehearsed through repetition and expense. Celebrity amplified these costs. Hollywood's golden age coincided with San Simeon's peak social relevance. Stars accustomed to studio-controlled environments arrived expecting comfort, privacy, and novelty. Meeting those expectations required constant upgrades, new guest houses, improved amenities, and increasingly elaborate diversions. Swimming pools were not just functional, they were visual statements. Terraces were designed for photographs. Views were framed as backdrops. Hearst understood spectacle instinctively. As a publisher, he knew the power of imagery. Though the estate was private, stories about it circulated through whispers, gossip, and carefully managed leaks. San Simeon became mythic not because it was seen, but because it was partially hidden. Maintaining that mystique demanded restraint as well as excess, a delicate balance that increased operational complexity. Security added another layer of cost. High-profile guests required protection, discretion, and controlled access. The remoteness of the hill, once a liability, became an asset, but only if managed carefully. Transportation schedules were coordinated. Staff movements were regulated. Privacy became a resource to be guarded as carefully as any artifact. Yet the most significant cost of spectacle was not financial. It was structural. San Simeon's architecture began responding less to function and more to display. Rooms were designed for impression rather than use. Spaces were preserved in a state of readiness for guests who might never arrive. The castle existed perpetually on the verge of performance, consuming resources even in stillness. Over time, this transformed the estate into something paradoxical, a place simultaneously alive and frozen. Its systems ran continuously, but its purpose narrowed. It no longer evolved organically. It maintained an image. As Hearst aged and global conditions darkened, the energy required to sustain this illusion grew heavier. The spectacle that once projected power now demanded it. And behind the laughter, the dinners, and the ocean views, the cost of keeping San Simeon relevant quietly accumulated, waiting for a moment when the performance could no longer be sustained. By the mid-1930s, the economic reality surrounding San Simeon began to shift in ways that even William Randolph Hearst could no longer fully control. The Great Depression had reshaped the American financial landscape, and although Hearst remained extraordinarily wealthy, the foundations of his empire were under increasing strain. Advertising revenues declined. Newspaper circulation softened. Debt once manageable within a booming economy became heavier, more visible, and harder to defer. San Simeon, however, did not adjust easily to austerity. Its costs were not elastic. The estate had been designed to expand, not contract. Staff levels could not be reduced without compromising operations. Infrastructure required constant upkeep, regardless of guest lists or social calendars. European artifacts already purchased still demanded storage, conservation, and insurance. The castle consumed money simply by existing. Hearst responded not by abandoning the project, but by slowing it. Construction became more selective, more cautious, yet it never truly stopped. This created a new form of expense: partial completion. Buildings left unfinished still required protection from the elements. Systems installed for future expansion now served underutilized spaces, operating inefficiently. The absence of closure generated waste rather than savings. Financial complexity deepened as Hearst relied increasingly on loans secured against his media holdings. Banks, once deferential, began to demand oversight. For the first time, San Simeon existed within a financial context that required explanation. The castle was no longer merely a private indulgence. It was a liability referenced in negotiations, quietly reshaping perceptions of Hearst's solvency. This shift marked a profound change. For decades, Hearst had used wealth to assert independence from governments, from institutions, from constraint. Now, the scale of his commitments limited that freedom. Decisions made in one era echoed into another. Money already spent could not be recovered. Structures already built could not be unbuilt without incurring further loss. World events intensified this pressure. As Europe moved toward war, the flow of artifacts slowed, then stopped. The global supply chain that had fed San Simeon for years collapsed almost overnight. Yet the castle, designed to absorb constant inflow, had no mechanism for pause. Maintenance costs persisted. Staff remained. The estate entered a phase of enforced stillness, one that revealed how dependent it had become on perpetual motion. Hearst himself aged visibly during this period. The energy that once fueled constant revision gave way to reflection and caution. San Simeon shifted from a site of ambition to one of memory. Rooms filled with objects acquired across decades became reminders of choices made when limits seemed irrelevant. By the early 1940s, financial restructuring became unavoidable. Portions of Hearst's empire were reorganized. Assets were leveraged. Expenses were scrutinized. San Simeon survived, but no longer expanded freely. The castle had reached its maximum expression, not because the vision was complete, but because the cost of continuation had finally become undeniable. This moment matters not as a fall from grace, but as a reckoning. It reveals the true nature of the project. San Simeon was never designed to coexist with constraint. It was born in abundance and sustained by momentum. When those forces weakened, the castle did not collapse but it froze. Preserved in the shape, it happened to hold at the moment history intervened. And in that stillness, the question sharpened: what happens to a private empire when its creator can no longer afford its imagination? When William Randolph Hearst gradually withdrew from San Simeon in the 1940s, the castle did not enter retirement with him. Instead, it entered a new and complicated phase of existence. One defined not by creation, but by responsibility. The question was no longer how much it cost to build the estate, but how much it would cost to keep it alive. Hearst never fully abandoned the hill. He retained ownership, continued to fund basic operations, and resisted any suggestion that the property be dismantled or sold. Yet the era of unchecked spending was over. The castle, once fueled by ambition, now relied on preservation. And preservation at this scale proved to be its own form of expense. Even in partial use, San Simeon required constant care. Stone weathered, metal corroded, wood swelled and cracked in the coastal air. The same isolation that had once ensured privacy now complicated maintenance. Every repair required transportation, skilled labor, and specialized knowledge. There was no surrounding city to absorb these needs. The castle remained an island. After Hearst's death in 1951, the financial reality sharpened further. His heirs inherited not only a historic estate, but an obligation they could not easily fulfill. The castle generated no income proportional to its needs. It was too large to maintain privately, too culturally significant to neglect, and too complex to divide. The decision to transfer Hearst Castle to the state of California in 1957 marked a turning point. What had once been a personal expression of power became a public responsibility. But public ownership did not simplify the problem, it transformed it. Preservation replaced indulgence, yet the costs remained enormous. Opening the estate to visitors required new infrastructure, visitor centers, safety upgrades, transportation systems, and staffing. Public access introduced wear on surfaces never designed for crowds. Foot traffic eroded floors. Moisture from breath and movement affected delicate interiors. Conservation became a continuous process rather than a goal. Unlike private maintenance, public preservation demanded transparency. Budgets were scrutinized. Repairs justified. Every dollar spent had to balance historical integrity with fiscal responsibility. Decisions once made by personal preference now required committees, approvals, and long-term planning. Yet even under state care, the hidden costs persisted. European artifacts required specialized conservation techniques. Aging mechanical systems needed constant retrofitting to meet modern safety standards. Earthquake retrofits introduced structural interventions that had to remain invisible to preserve aesthetic authenticity. Perhaps the greatest cost was conceptual. Hearst Castle could no longer evolve. It had to be frozen in a particular moment of its history. Even though that moment had been arbitrarily defined by financial constraint rather than artistic completion. Preservation demanded acceptance of incompleteness. Visitors today experience San Simeon as a finished monument. In reality, they walk through a paused process. The castle is not complete, it is suspended. Its towers, pools, and rooms represent what existed when momentum stopped, not what was ultimately intended. This raises a profound question about legacy. Did Hearst succeed in building permanence? Or did he create a structure so dependent on resources that it could survive only by becoming something else entirely? In passing from private empire to public heritage, San Simeon exchanged one form of power for another. It no longer commanded through excess, but through endurance. Its cost, once hidden in private ledgers, became shared, distributed across taxpayers, conservators, and generations who inherited the responsibility of keeping it standing. And in that shared burden lies the final transformation of Hearst's vision, from possession to obligation. When all calculations are exhausted, when materials, labor, logistics, technology, and preservation are finally tallied, what remains of San Simeon is not a number, but a question. What does it mean to spend without an end, to build without finality, and to leave behind something so vast that no single generation can fully claim it? Hearst Castle stands today not as a completed dream, but as a fossilized moment of possibility. It embodies a period in American history when private wealth could rival public institutions, when ambition faced few structural limits, and when personal vision could be imposed on land, labor, and history itself. The castle's grandeur is undeniable, but so is its silence. It no longer speaks of expansion. It speaks of containment. The true hidden cost of San Simeon is time. Decades of human effort were concentrated into a single private geography. Skills were refined, repeated, and ultimately sealed into walls that could never reciprocate. The project consumed lifetimes, not only Hearst's, but those of architects, craftsmen, laborers, and caretakers whose names are largely absent from the narrative, yet whose work defines every surface. There is also the cost of displacement. By removing fragments of Europe from their original contexts, San Simeon transformed living history into static display. While preservation saved many artifacts from decay, it also stripped them of continuity. They became components of a new story, one authored not by culture, but by acquisition. Economically, the castle demonstrates the paradox of excess. Unlimited resources did not produce efficiency or clarity. They produced delay, revision, and suspension. San Simeon reached its final form not because it was finished, but because the conditions that sustained it could no longer continue. In this way, the castle is less a monument to success than a boundary marker, the point at which even extraordinary wealth encounters gravity. Culturally, its meaning has shifted. What was once a private assertion of power is now a public inheritance of responsibility. The burden of maintenance, conservation, and interpretation has been distributed across society. The cost has become collective, normalized, and ongoing. San Simeon no longer belongs to one man's imagination, it belongs to time. And yet, this transformation does not diminish its significance. It deepens it. Hearst Castle endures precisely because it failed to conclude. Its incompleteness allows it to function as a lens through which we examine ambition, control, and legacy. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about what we choose to preserve and why. In the end, the castle does not ask to be admired. It asks to be understood. Its towers and terraces frame the Pacific not as conquest, but as contrast. Nature continues without accounting. The hill remains indifferent to ownership. What lingers is the realization that the most expensive structures are not those built of stone, but those built without limits. San Simeon is not a warning, nor a triumph. It is a record. A record of what happens when vision outpaces consequence, when wealth escapes context, and when a private empire becomes too large to disappear. The costs that were never disclosed are no longer hidden. They are embedded in maintenance schedules, in conservation debates, in public budgets, and in the collective memory of a place that was never meant to last this long. And still, the castle stands.